Hey, fighting game fans, what is up? It is I, FGF Chris, and I'm proud to bring you the first episode of my new program, Twilight Hadoukens, with me, FGF Chris. And in this show, we're going to be talking nothing else except fighting games. Whether it's the history, the aesthetics, the series, the music, the gameplay, it is strictly about fighting games. First off, I'm going to give a formal introduction to myself, how I became a fighting game fanatic. Then after that, we're going to be talking about what defines a fighting game, what makes a fighting game relevant to that genre. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of fighting games and, shoot the shit a little bit. So a little backstory. I became a fighting game fan back in the early 90s, okay? Now, not to give away my age or anything, but I've been born somewhere between 1980 and 1990, let's just say that. Well, anyways, when I was a little brat back in the early 1990s, I owned 3 systems. The original NES, the Super NES, and the Sega Genesis. Now, my first experience with a fighting game was from the Sega Genesis system, and that would be Street Fighter II Hyper Fighting. And then after I got into that game and played the hell out of it with my older brother, I became obsessed with fighting games. Now, when Street Fighter II was released, that was like the very first and only fighting game that was released back in 1991, not counting Fatal Fury. But as the years went on, between, the early 90s and the mid-90s, more fighting games became prevalent. There was Samurai Showdown and Mortal Kombat that I got my hands on for that Sega Genesis system back in the day. And I loved it. I played the original Samurai Showdown and played as Haomaru, Nakaruru, Jubei. It was a really, really fun time. And then when Mortal Kombat came out, my older brother was like, oh my god, this is really hardcore stuff. You get to rip off heads of your enemies, rip out their hearts, and no one has ever seen a fighting game like that, or a video game that graphic and that violent back in the 90s. Hell, that was a very trend-setting type game. And not just Mortal Kombat, but Samurai Showdown, the idea of fighting with weapons. And then Street Fighter was, basically the grandpa of fighting games, the Genghis Khan of fighting games, the OG of ass-kickery. You could only imagine the impact that fighting games had on me at that time. As time did progress, though, especially anywhere between 1995 and 2003, back when I was in middle school and high school, there were a lot of 3D fighting games that came out. Virtua Fighter, I think, was one of the very first, followed by Tekken, and then Soul Calibur, and then Dead or Alive. And 3D fighting games kind of took the genre of 2D fighting games and added an extra unique element to it. Instead of fighting in a straight line, you could move around the whole stage. And it is a very, very beautiful thing to see the progression, the evolution, the mutation of certain video game genres. Not just fighting games, but the innovation of turning 2D into 3D in any genre is pretty damn awesome. And it kept video games fresh and relevant into our cultural society. It is really cool stuff. And so, anyway, I became a Tekken fan when I was in high school. I was a huge Tekken fan. Ever since, in the PS2 days, that they released Tekken Tag Tournament, I was hooked. I was like, I want to see more Tekken, and I want to see more games like this in general from other companies, and then I got into Rival Schools, and then Project Justice, those 3D fighting games. Soul Calibur was amazing. I had the hots for Taki. Taki is a hot ninja chick in it, and it's like, oh my god, wow, she's 3D. She almost looks like she's real. Really mind blowing stuff. And don't let me get don't get me started on SNK, because when SNK really dropped their titles on really prominent systems, I was obsessed with SNK. King of Fighters, Fatal Fury, Art of Fighting, Savage Reign. The list goes on, really. Yes, yeah, Last Blade, Samurai Showdown, all that jazz. Long story short, fighting games from when I was first introduced till now had like a snowball effect on me. Once it kept rolling along, getting more and more obsessed with fighting games, the bigger the snowball got. And I am, the fighting game fanatic. So you can imagine, like, my obsession with the fighting game genre. It's good stuff. Anyway, enough about me. Let's talk a little bit about fighting games. And, if you're new to the program and you don't really know too much about fighting games, well, I am like the whiz kid, the doctor, the scientist of fighting games, the historian of fighting games, everything. I am the fighting game fanatic. You have a question to ask me, I'll give you an answer. I think to start off, we have to look at the origin of the fighting game. Where did it come from? Technically, what was the first fighting game that invented the genre? Well, there's a few different arguments with this, because in the old NES days, there was a lot of martial arts styled games, but some of them would be classified as brawlers or beat 'em ups, and those are not fighting games. But we will get to what defines a fighting game a little bit later. Right now, let's focus on the origin. Now, with all those brawlers and beat 'em ups aside, the first fighting game ever made came out in 1987, over 30 years ago, and that game was Street Fighter. Now, why was it a fighting game? Well, because you fight people. You fight people on an equal playing ground. Okay, you have a health bar. Your enemy has a health bar. And the idea is to diminish your enemy's health bar before yours gets diminished, basically knocking out your opponent. And that is a true essence of what a fighting game is. The concept of Street Fighter was ingenious for the time, but it got very unnoticed in the West. The original Street Fighter, that is. Because, there's a lot of different, better games out there. You had Capcom's Mega Man, you had Contra, a bunch of popular side-scrolling shoot-'em-up games, which dominated the market back in the day. But then you had Street Fighter coming along, and got a lot of praise in Japan, not so much in the West. But it wasn't until 4 years later, in 1991, that Street Fighter 2 came out, and basically said, hey, you and a friend, you and your brother, you and whoever can sit down and beat the crap out of each other and play through an arcade mode of the game. And the concept of competitive fighting in a video game was very unheard of, for the time. You didn't have... Nowadays we have, like, FPSs, first-person shooters, you have zombie killing games, you have puzzle games, party games, etc. And it is true that, even in the old NES days and Super NES days, you had competitive gameplay. You did have games that you could compete with other people for a certain goal in the game. But nothing was more appealing than a fighting game, because that is like the true essence of what rivalry in a video game is. Using martial arts skills to beat up your friend, your brother, your sibling, whoever, and kicking their ass, like in a very simplistic, straightforward manner. That is really, really get groundbreaking stuff. In fact, I would argue, and people are going to probably hate me for this, but I would argue that if it wasn't for the fighting game genre, a lot of other genres of competitive gameplay wouldn't have advanced as much as they did. Okay? And yeah, that's a little bit of a stretch, and I'm half saying it as like a otaku fanboy, but there's some truth to that, really, if you think about it. So yeah, fighting games are the shizzle. It is really good shit. And yeah, so we'll get back to like this topic of what defines a fighting game. In a traditional sense, fighting is relevant to martial arts. And if you ever been to a karate tournament, or if you ever taken taekwondo classes, or kendo classes, or karate classes, kung fu, whatever, you would know that when you're battling an opponent, it is one-on-one most of the time. Now, there's a few exceptions, like in Aikido, sometimes you do a randori, where you have to fight 4 people at once. And other variations of different styles have incorporated more than one person fighting, for like self-defense purposes. But anyway, the key aspect of what makes fighting is one-on-one, kill or be killed, knock out or be knocked out, whatever. And it's a really, really straightforward, simplistic thing, but you have to use a lot of common sense, a lot of strategy involved in it too. You got to block, you got to punch, you got to kick, you got to throw. And the fighting game genre set the pace for that. Set the standard that, hey, you're going to use martial arts abilities to fight your opponent, and that's how it is. It's as if you were in a fight night in Taekwondo, where you're like a blue belt and you're fighting a black belt. And basically, like, that's the difficulty setting. You could be the black belt fighting the white belt, or vice versa, the white belt fighting the black belt. And, and if you're fighting someone really skilled at a fighting game, it kind of resembles fighting someone with a high skill in a martial arts style in real life. Now, over the years, fighting games have changed the recipe quite a bit. In some games, you fight one-on-one. Other games, you fight 3-on-3, like King of Fighters. Or you fight a tag team of 2 characters, like Marvel vs. Capcom. Or you could fight with swords and weapons, like Samurai Showdown. And some have 3D elements, and is a 3D game instead of a 2D game, like Tekken, Soul Calibur, Dead or Alive. And so basically the style has mutated and evolved into different things over the years. But it's still kept at its core what makes it a fighting game. It's still, you got the health bar, you got that meter, you got the martial arts skills, and you got one person that you got your eye on to take down. And that never really changed too much. Now, there's a few untraditional fighting games that came out over the years, and one of them would be Super Smash Bros. This is a really good example of a fighting game that breaks all traditional elements to it. Instead of fighting one-on-one, you could fight as 4 characters on a screen at once. Now, people think, oh, it's a fighting game, but other people think, oh, this is a brawler. But it's actually kind of like a mix between the two. It is definitely a fighting game in its own right, but definitely not traditional. Definitely a fun party game, but to call it a true fighting game, I would be like, that's a gray area, really. And another game that came out that was non-traditional was Power Stone and Power Stone 2. They were released for the Sega Dreamcast back in the day, and they never really got too popular in the West, but that's another Super Smash Bros. Style fighting game. or brawler game. Hybrid, whatever the gray area is. If you ever find yourself asking, what is a fighting game? Am I playing a fighting game at this very moment? The best thing to do is to compare the game that you're currently playing with Street Fighter 2. Is it like Street Fighter 2? Is it like Fatal Fury? Is it like, Mortal Kombat? Etc. Or is it a 3D fighting game like Soul Calibur, Tekken, DOA? And when you basically use that comparison of what you're currently playing with the standard of what a fighting game is, that will answer your question. Brawlers are definitely not fighting games. If you're playing Final Fight or Streets of Rage, you're not playing a fighting game, you're playing a brawler. You're walking down the street, kicking multiple enemies' ass, and, save the day. It's kind of no different than playing a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up, like Contra or Metal Slug, really. So yeah, that's basically what a fighting game is. A martial arts game where you beat the shit out of your friends. Yeah. So anyway, this is my first episode of my audio show here, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Stay classy and watch the Twilight Hadoukens with FGF Chris. Later.